My favorite Thursday of every month is tonight because Joel Connelly of SeattlePI.com and Mike Seeley of the Seattle Weekly are right here on Public Exposure. I'm Stan Emmer. Joel and Mike, welcome to the show.
Good evening.
Howdy.
Awful lots of stuff happening, but particularly let's go right to the graphic. Let's go right to the oil spill. Here is, by the way, the BP Oil environmental site operating at the Energy Frontiers, Environment and Society. And then let's just go to a picture. That's pretty ugly. Joel, let's talk about lessons from the Gulf oil spill. You said in a column just the other day, this disaster needs to drill a fundamental truth into the heads of Americans. What is that?
Which is that you can trust big oil about as far as you can push a supertanker into a dock. Namely that we have for too long kind of given the nation's energy future to them. We've believed their assurances, the assurances that oil drilling could be done safely before in Santa Barbara Channel back in the 1960s, to the assurances that there would never be a tanker accident in Prince William Sound, to the assurances that the pipes up at Prudhoe Bay were the best that technology could deliver, and they could never leak. They would never leak oil. Now we see these promises again proving themselves to be totally false, facing a disaster potentially larger than the Gulf of or the Exxon Valdez, 120,000 gallons a day leaking into the waters of the Gulf of Mexico, and threatening to wash ashore into an area of the country where big oil has owned the politicians. So again, we have a BP refinery here. We have major BP operations in Alaska. We have 4 refineries, or as Warren Magnuson used to call them, distilleries, operating on northern Puget Sound. Again, we need to take the lesson in terms of alternative energy, but also vigilance toward those that that are the masters of the carbon economy to account.
Mike, the readers of the Weekly, how closely in touch are they with this particular issue?
Quite. I mean, our readership tends to be, right in line with the very vigilant environmental movement, as if Louisiana hadn't been hit hard enough in recent years. I think that adds a double layer of tragedy to this whole thing.
Joel, you've got a quote in your column from Dr. Douglas Brinkley, an historian, and he says, "We've got to stop listening to the oil companies' fake environmental rhetoric." What do we do?
First of all, there are certain areas where essentially competing values and so on mean that we should put these areas off limit to oil drilling. It's been many, many years since then Seattle Congressman Mike Lowry suggested that in making policy decisions on the Outer Continental Shelf, what we needed to do is evaluate recreation and fisheries alongside potential energy development, and that there would be cases and that there would be areas where in fact other values, such as a very healthy fishing industry, outweigh the potential gains from petroleum development. The Obama administration started to recognize this by putting Bristol Bay off limits to oil and gas drilling in the decision last month. I think that they now have to review other Alaskan waters. Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger of California said today that that his support for renewed drilling in the Santa Barbara Channel is off the table, and we need to essentially wait until we find out what has gone wrong here and correct it before we allow new drilling any place.
We can regulate those entities that are drilling inside United States waters, but we can't regulate the largest oil companies in the world. For example, let's go to this graphic. The world's largest oil companies, and this is in terms of per day. Let's go to the next click, because there we are. They're Saudi Arabia, National Iranian, Qatar, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, General Petroleum, and Nigeria. And then again, they're not, I don't think, conducting offshore drilling. But are we going to get to a point where the WTO is going to weigh into this?
But I think that makes a fundamental point, namely that these people do not have any permanent allegiances. They only have permanent interests. The interest is getting the oil out, regardless, or as George Bush would say, irregardless of whether you have to pay off a local dictator, risk the environment, what have you, which means that we need to guard what is ours, which is to say our coastline, our environment, our fisheries. We also need to guard our continent. The British Columbia government and the Canadian federal governments have seemingly been hot to drill in the area between Haida Gwaii, the Queen Charlotte Islands, and the mainland, despite, regardless of the fisheries resources there and the currents and so on, and the fact that you have some of the roughest seas in the western North America. I think we need to intervene on that type of decision in terms of, because some of the salmon are, of course, swimming into our waters to spawn in our rivers. So again, I think our obligation is to protect the continent, and if somebody takes a trade case against us to some international body, we basically say we're protecting ours, and the hell with you.
Mike, Joel brings up a very, very big point that we have rarely touched on here, and it's about the companies that don't have allegiance to anybody. And we have a couple of those companies that are, you could say that they're based right here, Microsoft and Boeing. Of course, Boeing's not based here anymore, but do they have allegiances to anybody?
They have allegiance to their customers. They have allegiance to demand. And if we're talking about demand for oil, you know, behavior is not going to change unless demand changes. And Joel touched briefly on alternative energy. I mean, this is a golden opportunity for their alternative energy moment. It could have been a golden opportunity for Democrats and environmentalists, and probably still is to a certain degree, but President Obama, by, you know, offering the concession of offshore drilling, kind of squandered an opportunity before it happened.
But BP is not going to make it all right by paying for the spill cleanup?
There was a wonderful post-Exxon Valdez headline in the Anchorage Times, "Spill good for Alaskan economy, question mark." Well, ultimately, it was not. Ultimately, of course, you had a company resisting punitive damage awards for 15 years, bouncing between federal district court, federal appellate court, and finally the U.S. Supreme Court, which cut the award to 1/10 of what the federal district court had. 20% of the plaintiffs died during the course of the litigation. One of the judges that heard this, Russell Wiggins, died during the litigation. You can line up the promises that Exxon made during the height of the cleanup with the 15 years that they stalled on this. And again, look at more recent statements. Their obligations are essentially to shareholders.
Okay. Let's move on to a different topic, but speaking of stalling, and this was in the Seattle Weekly, and it's an article entitled "Between Iraq and Tacoma," and this is a long-detained prisoner asked the government to deport him. An immigration judge ordered him deported to Iraq, where the U.S. has repatriated 43 people in the past year and a half. That decision was affirmed by the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals last year, yet Malcandy remains at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma. Now, he has become Christian while he was in the detention center, or maybe even before. And so if he were to be deported to Iraq, is the U.S. government, by keeping him detained, saving his life?
That's a really interesting question. I would imagine his religion might waver a little bit if he went back to Iraq. But, you know, this to me is an American and international tragedy, really, just the continued uncertainty of what to do with these detainees. There's no due process involved. That's one of our country's values, and you know, if foreigners happen to be on our soil, we should be expected to extend those values to them.
You know, you just said it. It's one of our country's values, and the question is what are our values? You know, have the American values been compromised? And you know, Joel, the situation, of course, in Cuba with Guantanamo is still hanging there to a certain extent. The question of detainees, as Mike was talking about, have American values just, I mean, do we have them anymore?
We've come to a situation, of course, where former Vice President Cheney's daughter is denouncing the existence in the Justice Department of attorneys that brought suits for the violation of the Constitution and the holding of people at Gitmo. I think it is a situation where there has been a demagoguery abroad in the land. The current administration seems very hesitant to face it. The curious situation is that some of the people that we have released, you know, went to Aden and Yemen and began to again organize terrorist activities, while you have these kind of strays that remain under our detention and who can't get out. It is a strange situation, I think, made even more disturbing by the hesitance of the current administration and its inability to face what it sees as negative political consequences.